Keep the hounds up, men. He can't be too far. Wait, did you hear something? Over there. There he goes. Let the hounds go. We got him now.
For more than 200 years, blacks were slaves in this country. White slave owners liked to think that blacks were happy that way. This was a false attitude, because it said more about slave owners than the slaves. Blacks hated slavery.
Oh, how long before the sun goes down?
Children of slaves automatically became slaves themselves. This fact of slavery helped to increase the slave population. But until about 1725, most of the slaves in America were natives of Africa. Africans from the same tribes and nations were intentionally separated. Even members of the same family were sold to different masters.
African languages, customs, and religious rituals were outlawed. Slaves had to learn English just to speak to each other. These and other strict measures made it very difficult for slaves to organize against the slaveholders or slave masters.
The slave masters soon learned that a man who is separated from his own language, culture, and history loses most of his identity. And when a man doesn't know who he really is, he makes a better slave.
But slave conditions were so unbearably miserable that many Africans protested in whatever way they could.
Thought you could get away, huh? Tie his hands behind him, Jonas. We'll take him back and show the other slaves what happens to runaways. The rest of you remember what you saw today. I don't know why you people want to run off anyway. You got everything you need right here.
Slaves had what they needed, but they wanted their freedom. And many got it by running away to the north. The desire to be free was often greater than the slave's fear of the white man.
Some American slaves were inspired to act by a slave revolt, which occurred on the island of Santo Domingo in 1791. Santo Domingo, now called Haiti, was formerly owned by the French. Coffee, sugar, and spice plantations had kept 450,000 African slaves toiling for their French masters.
The French slave system differed greatly from the American system.
No. There is no time to watch our slaves every minute. Let them speak as they wish, pray as they wish, think as they wish. But we put them to work early and make them work hard. The weakest die, and we replace them quickly.
The slaves who stayed alive in Santo Domingo were not like the voiceless, nameless, homeless slaves of America. They clung to their African roots, and they knew who they were. They also knew that they outnumbered the Frenchmen on the island.
The Haitian Slaves' Rebellion began in the summer of 1791. One night in August, the whole northern portion of the island seemed to burst into flames. An eyewitness recalls the frightening scene.
The first sight which arrested our attention was a dreadful scene of devastation by fire. Ruins still smoking and houses and plantations at that moment in flames.
The battle lasted 12 years. When it was over in 1802, Haiti had become a free black nation. News of that successful slave rebellion told American slaves that they did not have to submit meekly to slavery. Thousands of American slave owners began to fear for their lives.
We are disposed to great caution, and fear guides our every move. We have built a shed back in the woods to hide if the Negroes come out into the area. We kept near the door so we can carry them off quickly at news of a revolt.
The Haitian Rebellion is the only successful slave uprising in history. In America, dozens of slave revolts occurred between 1650 and 1850, but the slaves always lost. They didn't have enough guns to overpower their white owners and were not well organized.
Restrictions against slave meetings prevented the slaves from organizing. White slave patrols rigidly enforced these rules.
A milder form of slave protest was the work slowdown.
We picked a mess of cotton this week. I don't know about the rest of y'all, but I never worked so hard before. Things getting worse and worse around here. I bet if we just work real slow for a few days, Master Tom gonna make some changes.
Oh, how come me here? Oh, how come me here?
My slaves just ain't doing the work they used to. Claim they're sick. Fine time for that. I missed a good market on sugar last week because they didn't have enough cane cut for me to sell. If this keeps up, I'll be ruined. Even whipping doesn't help. It's like they was doing it on purpose.
Oh, how come me here? I wish I'd have never been born.
Running away, destroying property, slowing down in the fields, armed revolt. These all had their place in early slave protest.
In the period of the Revolutionary War, many planters were off their plantations. Without the threat of their masters' whips, slaves ran away more often and rebelled with less fear. One of the most famous slave freedom songs was "Follow the Drinking Gourd." The drinking gourd in the song referred actually to the Big Dipper. Slaves used this and other songs to secretly pass along escape plans from one group to another.
Come and go with me to my father's house, to my father's house, to my father's house. Come and go with me to my father's house. There is
Did you hear that? Are we gonna run off tonight?
That's what the man said. Just follow the North Star. It's easy to find. It's that big one up there in the drinking gourd.
Running off was dangerous. Slave patrols used dogs to hunt down fugitive slaves. There was also another way to possible freedom: the Underground Railroad.
The Underground Railroad was not really under the ground, and it wasn't really a railroad as you know one today. It was a network of secret escape routes for runaway slaves.
The slaves moved at night to avoid possible capture. They stopped to rest and eat at carefully selected spots in homes of people who sympathized with the slaves. These homes were called stations and were about 20 miles apart.
The Underground Railroad worked mainly through the states of Pennsylvania and Ohio. Canada usually was the final stop, though many fugitive slaves stayed in the northern states. Quakers, free blacks, and other anti-slavery groups donated money to keep the freedom operation going.
Levi Coffin, a white man from North Carolina, was a member of an anti-slavery group called the Society of Friends. He became a conductor on the Underground Railroad when he moved to Newport, Indiana.
Oh, get right and stay right. Oh, get right, be ready when your freedom comes.
Soon after we located at Newport, I found that we were on the line of the Underground Railroad. Fugitives often passed through that place and generally stopped among the colored people. Friends in the neighborhood who had formerly stood aloof from the work, fearful of the penalty of the law, were encouraged to engage in it when they saw the fearless manner in which I acted and the success that attended my efforts.
Conductors on the Underground Railroad risked their lives by helping slaves escape. Because of this, they wouldn't stand for cowardly slaves who tried to run back to the South. One slave described an episode with conductor John Fairfield.
I never seed such a man as Fairfield. He told us he'd take us out of slavery or die in the attempt, if we'd do our part, which we promised to do. We all agreed to fight till we died, rather than be captured. Fairfield said he wanted no cowards in the company. If we's attacked and one of us showed cowardice or started to run, he'd shoot him down.
The most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman, who also was a runaway slave. She made 19 trips back and forth into the South, leading nearly 300 slaves to freedom in the North.
Miss Harriet, how far to the next station?
Never mind. Just keep up with me and stay low.
Miss Harriet, what was that?
Sounds like some slave hounds. Stay still for a minute. They won't smell nothing in this rain except worms. Okay, now let's go.
Wait, Miss Harriet. I'm afraid to go. If my master catches me out here, he'll kill me.
Just a second. You take one single step to the south and I'll kill you myself. I got a pistol and I know how to shoot. Now get your feet moving toward freedom.
The Underground Railroad and its conductors carried many thousands of slaves to freedom. But for those slaves who saw no chance or hope for escape, death often was the only answer. Suicide was frequent. There were even cases of mothers killing their infant children to keep them from living through the horrors of slavery.
Slaves knew what it was like to watch a friend kill himself out of despair. They knew how it felt to see a brother or a sister whipped and tortured. They knew the misery of having their families torn apart. And they knew the agony of having to bow down to the white man who was responsible for all these things.
I don't know a white man alive who could watch his brother whipped to death and then walk up to the man with the whip and bow down to him. But that's what they ask us to do. They say to obey and work hard and don't get mad if they kill your mother or your sister. They treat their dogs better.
Slavery drove the slaves to hate their white masters. Even so-called kind masters sometimes were attacked and killed. For it was slavery itself, not always the white masters, that slaves hated so fiercely.
Way over in Egypt's land, you shall gain the victory. Way over in Egypt's land, brother, you...
A slave named Gabriel made elaborate plans for an insurrection in Richmond, Virginia in 1800. Several buildings were to be seized, and the hostile whites in the town were to be killed.
But one of the slaves involved in the plot revealed the plans to his master. The Richmond militia was stationed around the town waiting for the slaves. On the night of the scheduled insurrection, a violent storm kept Gabriel and his men from entering the town, and Gabriel's insurrection never materialized. Some of those involved in the plot were hanged.
In 1822, Denmark Vesey planned another insurrection. Once a slave in Haiti, Vesey bought his freedom and settled in Charleston, South Carolina.
He was a skilled craftsman, as were the other leaders of the plot. He criticized the way his fellow blacks conducted themselves in the company of white men. A friend of Vesey once said of him,
"Even whilst walking through the streets in the company of another, he was not idle. For if his companion bowed to a white person, he would rebuke him and observe that all men are born equal, and that he was surprised that anyone would degrade himself by such conduct, that he would never cringe to the whites, nor ought anyone who had the feelings of a man."
The day for the revolt was chosen, the second Sunday in July, 1822. On Sundays, a lot of slaves often came into town, so nobody would be suspicious at seeing several hundred blacks filtering into the area.
Vesey's weapons consisted of 250 pikeheads and bayonets and 300 daggers, but the revolt never happened. One slave in the conspiracy gave information that led to the arrest of two of the leaders. The two were released after convincing the local officials that there was no plot and that they were innocent of all charges.
A second slave confessed, however, and more arrests were made. One of the slaves arrested agreed to cooperate and revealed the names of several participants. 131 blacks were arrested, and 49 were executed.
In 1831, a Virginia slave named Nat Turner led an insurrection that cost the lives of 57 whites. After he was caught, Nat Turner described what had led him to plan his uprising.
On the 12th of May, 1828, I heard a loud noise in the heavens, and the Spirit instantly appeared to me and said, the serpent was loosened, and Christ had laid down the yoke he had borne for the sins of men, and that I should take it on and fight against the serpent. For the time was fast approaching when the first should be last, and the last should be first. It was quickly agreed that we should commence at the home of Joseph Travis on that night, and until we had armed and equipped ourselves and gathered sufficient force, neither age nor sex was to be spared.
Nat Turner's insurrection was the most important slave revolt in America. For the first time, many whites were killed, some of them children. The revolt warned many far-sighted people in the North that more of the same would follow unless the slaves were freed. The anti-slavery movement shifted into high gear soon after.
Ready, hey, my Lord, getting us ready for that great and awful day. My Lord, getting us ready for that great.
Slave insurrections were not rare. They started whenever a group of slaves became desperate enough to give up their lives in the name of freedom. Cato, Coote, George Boxley, these and many more blacks led armed protests against slavery. Although insurrections frightened a lot of whites, they were not successful. The whites were always better armed than the blacks, and they had other advantages too.
Whites were familiar with the countryside. They were better equipped to organize and plan, and they were free to move about without restrictions.
Fear of slave insurrections played no small part in influencing some of the decisions of Southern politicians.
Midway through the 19th century, around 1855, before the Civil War, two considerations occupied the time of many Southern leaders: secession from the Union and annexing new territories. Decisions on both of these topics were guided by Southern fears of slave revolts.
Our expansion could solve one of our worst problems. With new lands, we could spread out the rebellious Negroes so that their numbers would be small everywhere.
Yes, we have every right to secede from the Union. But what of our slaves? If we secede, a civil war will result. And when the blacks hear about that, about a war to end slavery, they will rise in greater numbers than ever. We must not act in haste.
Fear made Southerners tighten their hold on their slaves.
The county of Macon has resolved the following rules as regards slaves residing therein. 1. No slave shall venture forth unaccompanied by a white man outside the limits of his plantation. 2. Gatherings and meetings of slaves shall be broken up by the master. 3. Singing in the field shall be disallowed, the like with singing in the slave quarters. 4. Slave quarters shall be searched regularly for hidden weapons.
This fear was clearly not limited to a few timid individuals. The entire South was aware of the dangers of organized slave insurrections.
These insurrections have alarmed my wife so as really to endanger her health, and I have not slept without anxiety in 3 months. Our nights are sometimes spent in listening to noises. A corn song or a hog call has often been the subject of a nervous terror, and a cat in the dining room will banish sleep for the night. There has been and there still is a panic in all this country.
They took the arsenal, and they're down at the railroad station now. They've already killed Haywood Shepard, the baggage handler.
Who, man, who?
John Brown and his men. They're trying to take over the whole city of Harper's Ferry.
John Brown, a white man, led a group of about 50 whites and blacks into the city of Harper's Ferry, Virginia in 1859. His immediate plans were to get ammunition from the arsenal, hold several important buildings temporarily, and then flee into the nearby woods if resistance became too strong.
John Brown's career did not begin at Harper's Ferry. By 1859, Brown was already notorious for his anti-slavery exploits in Kansas Territory. He wanted to keep slavery out of Kansas as well as out of all the other free soil territories.
Brown's ultimate goal was to bring the anti-slavery struggle into the South. He wanted to set up a sort of abolitionist republic in the Appalachian Mountains and to wage war on slavery with fugitive slaves and determined whites. But he was captured with most of his men near the Harper's Ferry train station. They had made their first and last stand. At his trial, John Brown said,
Had I so interfered in behalf of the rich, the powerful, the intelligent, the so-called great, or in behalf of any of their friends, either father, mother, brother, sister, wife, or children, or any of that class, and suffered and sacrificed what I have in this interference, it would have been all right. And every man in this court would have deemed it an act worthy of reward rather than punishment.
He was sentenced to death. Before he was hanged, John Brown left these final words.
I, John Brown, am not quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will ever be purged away but with blood. I had flattered myself, as I now think, by hoping that without much bloodshed it might be done.
Slave resistance in America is almost as old as slavery itself. It took several forms.
Work slowdowns angered planters by cutting down production or by stopping it altogether. This was slave resistance.
Running away from the plantations cost the planters money and lost labor and smaller crops. This was slave resistance.
But not all slaves resisted slavery. Few were happy as slaves, but many were overwhelmed by the helplessness of their situation. Seeing no way out, they resigned themselves to slavery and lost the spirit to fight for their freedom. But the issue of slavery continued to arouse many people, black and white, slave and free. Slave resistance and anti-slavery sentiment pressed the nation until it erupted into civil war.
There's a better day coming, hallelujah, better day coming, hallelujah. There's a better day coming, hallelujah, better day coming, hallelujah. For we don't feel.
We mourn not that the man should toil. 'Tis nature's need, 'tis God's decree. But let the hand that tills the soil be like the wind that fans it free.
Blacks fought for their freedom from chattel slavery in America for 250 years. No one could run off a plantation for them. No one could slow down in the fields for them. No one could suffer the whip for them. But white men and women in the North and the South carried on a different kind of a fight to help gain freedom for the black slaves. Black and white together joined the fight called abolition. It became a full-time struggle for many dedicated people.
Abolitionists toured the country to speak to the people about the wrongs of slavery. Many white men and women carried on the movement, but free blacks soon joined them as lecturers and planners. Abolition became a joint black-white effort to bring a peaceful end to slavery.
In the 1830s, many movements for social reform and religious revival sprang up in America. Reformers said slavery mocked America's concern for freedom. Religious leaders said slavery went against God's law. Anti-slavery societies began to appear in the North. Newspapers became a powerful weapon on the side of abolition.
The court calls Benjamin Lundy to the stand. Mr. Lundy, you claim that you were assaulted by the men sitting across from you there. Can you think of a reason that those men should try to harm you?
They did not like my activities towards abolishing slavery. I began printing The Genius of Universal Emancipation in 1821. The paper has been active in trying to abolish slavery. Apparently, those men disagreed with the idea of freeing the slaves. They tried to frighten me away.
You admit, then, that you are an abolitionist?
Of course. There is no crime in that.
Perhaps it is no crime. But when you fight to take away something that is valuable to many people, you must be prepared to suffer their revenge. I do not think your attackers were unjustified. I must warn you further that to continue your activities might again result in a well-deserved beating. This court is adjourned.
For every white man opposed to slavery, many more supported it. Abolitionists always fought an uphill battle. Benjamin Lundy believed in gradual abolition, yet even he was threatened and ridiculed, and found that courts and laws were not in his favor. Not all abolitionists were as patient as Lundy. Some were like William Lloyd Garrison, who fought for immediate and total emancipation. In 1831, in an editorial in his abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, Garrison pledged a lifelong battle against slavery.
I determined to lift up the standard of emancipation in the eyes of the nation, within sight of Bunker Hill and in the birthplace of liberty. That standard is now unfurled, and long may it float. Yea, till every chain be broken, and every bondman set free. Let all the enemies of the persecuted blacks tremble.
Way over in Egypt's land, you shall gain the victory. Way over in Egypt's land, brother, you gonna gain the day.
Blacks did not stand by while whites argued about their freedom. They were active in the abolition movement just as they were actively resisting white masters in the fields.
The greatest black abolitionist was Frederick Douglass, a former slave. In his newspaper, North Star, he urged blacks to work alongside white abolitionists.
Douglass escaped from slavery in 1838. He'd learned to read from his master's wife, and he quickly picked up literature on abolition. He found many of his beliefs in the writings of William Lloyd Garrison.
As leader of the nation's anti-slavery societies, Garrison was sharply criticized. The chief complaint, Garrison urged immediate and unconditional emancipation. Even many abolitionists were not ready for that.
Garrison said that the United States Constitution encouraged slavery. He counted on moral persuasion to move whites to demand constitutional changes. On the 4th of July, 1854, Garrison publicly burned a copy of the Constitution. This was his reason.
This action will inform the world of my opposition to compromises with tyranny and covenants with death. Let there be no dodging, no shuffling, no evasion. Let us confess the sin of our fathers and our own sin as a people in conspiring for the degradation and enslavement of the colored race among us. The truth is, our fathers were intent on securing liberty to themselves. They did not blush to enslave a portion of their fellow men and to buy and sell them as cattle in the market while they were boasting of their regard for the rights of man. 3 millions of the American people are crushed under the American Union. The government gives them no protection. The government is their enemy. The government keeps them in chains.
Douglass and Garrison met at meetings of the New England Anti-Slavery Society. Douglass impressed Garrison with his eloquence, and the two men formed a close alliance.
In 1847, Douglass met John Brown, the white abolitionist who was to lead the daring raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859.
Your ideas are good, Mr. Douglass, but I do not think words will ever have the same effect as actions.
Then you think the slave insurrections are a good idea, Mr. Brown?
The insurrections are good only in that they carry a strong message: freedom at any price. I do not agree that there should be killing and ransacking. Yet, as soon as the blacks have their freedom, which they deserve, the killing and ransacking will stop.
Although Douglass agreed with much that Brown said, he did not join him. Douglass feared that violent action would only harden white resistance to abolition. In 1849, he changed his mind.
I should welcome the news tomorrow that the slaves have risen in the South, and that the sable arms which have been engaged in beautifying and adorning the South were engaged in spreading death and devastation.
My Lord Gideon is ready for that great day. Hey, my Lord Gideon is ready for that great and awful day.
Free blacks, as well as slaves, were fed up with slavery, tired of watching their brothers wasting and dying in the cotton fields. David Walker was a free black who revealed this feeling in an appeal to the colored citizens of the world, written in 1829.
Walker appealed to his people to unite as men and fight for their freedom.
Oh, my colored brethren all over the world, when shall we arise from this death-like apathy and be men? Here, now, in the southern and western sections of this country, there are at least 3 colored persons for 1 white. Why is it then that those few weak whites are able to keep so many able men, one of whom can put to flight a dozen whites?
There's a better day coming, hallelujah, better day coming, hallelujah.
Walker's words were too strong for most whites. More than $10,000 was offered as a reward for Walker's capture, dead or alive. David Walker's appeal is said to have encouraged Nat Turner to stage his insurrection in 1831. Walker died mysteriously soon after that.
Other black abolitionists contributed time and money to the fight to end slavery.
Charles B. Ray, who promoted the American and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society in his newspaper, The Colored American.
Lewis Hayden, an escaped slave from Kentucky who made his way to Boston and became an abolitionist leader.
Sojourner Truth, one of the most famous black women of her day. Miss Truth was a slave for about 30 years until she escaped. From then on, she crusaded against slavery and discrimination. Here is her story of an incident on a segregated streetcar in Washington, D.C. Miss Laura Haviland, a white friend.
As Mrs. Haviland signaled the car, I stepped to one side as if to continue my walk. And when it stopped, I ran and jumped aboard. The conductor pushed me back.
Get out of the way and let this lady come in.
Whoops, sir. I am a lady, too. Mrs. Haviland, let us get into the car.
Hey, conductor, you can't let none of them folks in here.
Here now, Auntie. You'd better get off my car if you know what's good for you.
And you certainly better get your hands off of me. I most certainly will not get off this car.
Don't put her off, conductor.
Oh, does she belong to you, ma'am?
She does not. She belongs to humanity.
Then take her and go.
Miss Truth.
I will let you know whether you can shove me about like a dog. Mrs. Haviland, take the number of this man's car.
Miss Truth, we'd better get you to a hospital.
The conductor had slammed me hard against the door. When we arrived at the hospital, the surgeons were called in to examine my shoulder and found that a bone was misplaced. I complained to the president of the road. The fellow lost his situation.
Blacks and whites worked hard together. Being an abolitionist called for courage. Dozens of abolitionists were beaten. Some were killed. In 1837, a white newspaper man named Elijah P. Lovejoy was killed in his Alton, Illinois office.
God show. Stand still, children.
But while many Americans were hard at work to abolish slavery, others had little hope that whites would ever accept blacks as equals. They believed that separation of the races was the only solution to racial oppression and conflict, and separation for them meant colonization.
Colonization would return all free blacks to Africa. The idea of colonization had sprung up as far back as 1714. It gathered steam after the Revolutionary War, and in 1777, a committee headed by Thomas Jefferson drew up a plan of gradual emancipation and exportation. Other anti-slavery groups built planks into their platforms urging the colonization of free blacks outside the United States.
In 1815, the issue of colonization captured the country's attention in a dramatic way. Paul Cuffey, a wealthy free black, carried 38 free blacks to Africa at his own expense. Within 2 years after Cuffey's voyage, the American Colonization Society was formed. Agents set out to raise money to send free blacks to Liberia on Africa's west coast. But by 1830, the society had settled only 1,400 blacks in the colony.
Most blacks opposed colonization. In the same year that the American Colonization Society was formed, James Forten, a black abolitionist, led a meeting of 3,000 free blacks. They gathered at the Bethel Church in Philadelphia to discuss the colonization movement.
Then let me hear you. All those of you in favor of colonization, call out aye. All those of you opposed to colonization, call out no.
Soon after the Philadelphia meeting, Forten wrote to Paul Cuffey.
We had a large meeting of males at the Reverend R. Allen's church the other evening. 3,000 at least attended. and there was not one soul that was in favor of going to Africa. They think the slaveholders want to get rid of all free blacks so as to make their property more secure.
Supporters of colonization had many reasons. Some believed that slavery was immoral. They urged whites to end slavery and return blacks to their native land.
Others were convinced that free blacks would never be allowed to live peacefully in a white country. In 1795, an anonymous New Hampshire man wrote,
"If the Negroes should remain among us, though fully enfranchised, they'll not be treated upon terms of equality, and perhaps never rise to that rank which they deserve. Let them go, therefore. They'll never be men till they're treated like men. They'll never be citizens till they feel themselves so."
A few saw colonization as a way of carrying Christianity and Western civilization to Africa.
And many slaveholders viewed colonization as a way of getting rid of the free blacks who might one day stir the slaves to action. Kentucky Senator Henry Clay shared their feelings.
The noblest thing we can do is send these people back to their native land. If they are allowed to remain here, the danger of revolution will persist. Some go so far as to say that colonization would gradually do away with slavery. I say we must not allow ourselves to reach so high. Our purpose should be no more than to return all free Negroes to Africa.
Martin R. Delaney was a famous black abolitionist who later came to believe that blacks would be free only if they separated from whites.
Delaney never agreed to African colonization, but he thought that blacks could form their own nations in places like Central America or South America or even northern Canada.
Abolitionists and colonizationists often argued about the future of free blacks. One side said free blacks were free Americans. The other side said free blacks were free Africans and should return to Africa.
Whites in America were split on the issues of abolition and colonization.
Colonization, but no abolition.
Abolition and colonization. Complete abolition.
Most blacks were suspicious of colonization because slaveholders supported it. Black and white abolitionists knew that colonization without abolition would drain off America's free black population and make slavery even more secure. They saw that Southern slave owners would collect the biggest benefits.
Colonization gradually disappeared as a major issue in the anti-slavery movement.
Abolitionists fired up the tempers of both Northerners and Southerners before the Civil War. The issue of slavery came out into the open. Abolitionists called for an immediate end to slavery. They demanded that the rights of all human beings be honored. Then they urged the nation to act.
Black and white abolitionists shouted freedom for more than 100 years. The issue of slavery split the nation in two. People questioned whether the Union could survive as two feuding neighbors. In 1860, nearly 4 million slaves lived in the South. Soon, the Union Army would become the largest and strongest anti-slavery organization of them all.
Over in Egypt's land, you shall gain the victory. Way over in Egypt's land, brother, you gonna gain the day. March on, Lord, and you will gain the victory. March, march, my brother, Lord, you gonna gain the day. This is the year of Jubilee. You gonna gain the victory. Old Moses set his people free. You gonna gain the day. March on, Lord, and you will gain the victory. March, my brother, Lord, and you will gain the day. Way over in Egypt's land, you will gain the victory. Way over in Egypt's land, brother, you gonna gain the day. March on, Lord, and you will gain the victory. March, my brother, Lord, and you gonna gain the day. We need no cowards in our band. You shall gain the victory. We call for valiant-hearted man. You gonna gain the day. March on, Lord, and you will gain the victory. March, my brother, Lord, and you will gain the day.